They called Liam a horse thief and hung him by sunrise. His journal says the sheriff's been moving payroll through the old mines, and I'm going in after the truth. The inciting incident hadn't been a letter or a whispered rumor. It had been a package delivered by a freight runner who owed him a favor. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Liam's journal. His brother wasn't a man for prose. The book was filled with sketches of rock formations, notes on water sources, and meticulously drawn maps. Tucked into the back sleeve was the last thing he'd drawn: a crude map of the canyons north of Redemption, with a single jarring symbol marking a hidden fork, the brand of the Blackwood Mining Company, a ruthless outfit that had swallowed up smaller claims across the territory. And beneath it, a hastily scrawled note: Vance moves the payroll. He uses the old tunnels. He doesn't know I know. It wasn't a confession of guilt. It was a death warrant. Liam hadn't stolen horses. He'd stumbled onto something far more valuable and paid the ultimate price. The journal was the beginning, the first thread in a web of deceit that Elias was now determined to unravel, piece by bloody piece. His objective was clear: prove Vance was a thief and a murderer, and in doing so, reclaim his brother's name. The stakes were absolute. Failure meant Liam died a criminal, and Elias would likely end up swinging from the same rope. He pushed the journal back into his saddlebag, the weight of it a constant, burning reminder. The time for watching was over. It was time to descend into the viper's nest. His first move was to find the start of the trail, the physical proof that would corroborate Liam's last words. The livery stable reeked of hay and sweat, a place of constant motion. Liam's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Breaker, was still there. A loose-end Vance hadn't bothered to tie up. Elias paid the stable master a few coins to look the other way, his eyes scanning every detail. He ran a hand over Breaker's flank, a familiar gesture that settled the animal. Tucked into the worn stitching of the saddle blanket, he found it, a single black shard of rock, not native to the dusty plains around Redemption. Obsidian, volcanic glass. It was used in the Blackwood mines for blasting. It was the first piece of the puzzle, a tangible link between his brother, the mines, and Vance's operation. His next stop was the assayer's office. The man was a known drunk, his loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Elias didn't offer coin. He offered a choice. He placed the obsidian shard on the counter, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. He spoke of federal marshals taking an interest in the territory, of Blackwood's less-than-legal expansion, of a sheriff who was getting rich while the town starved. The assayer, his hands trembling, finally broke. He spoke of secret shipments, of payroll wagons that arrived empty, their manifest signed by Vance himself. He mentioned a woman, a cartographer named Elara, who'd been hired by Blackwood to map the old tunnels before being run out of town on Vance's orders. She knew the labyrinthine depths of the mountains better than anyone. She was the map, and according to the assayer, she was hiding out in the Badlands, waiting for a chance to get her revenge. Elias had his heading. He left the shard of obsidian on the counter, a silent promise. He now had a destination and a name. The trail was no longer cold. It was burning. The Badlands were a maze of sun-bleached rock and knife-edge shadows, a place where a man could disappear and never be found. It was here, in this desolate wilderness, that Elara had made her stand. Elias tracked her not by her trail, she was too skilled for that, but by the absence of one. He looked for the places a person would go to avoid being followed, the routes that defied logic but promised sanctuary. He found her camp tucked into a narrow box canyon, the entrance easily defended. A tripwire, almost invisible in the dust, was his only warning. He froze, his eyes tracing the thin strand of metal to a precariously balanced pile of rocks. A crude but effective alarm. He didn't disarm it. Instead, he called out, his voice calm and even. "Elara, The assayer in redemption sent me. I'm Liam Thorne's brother." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with suspicion. Then a voice, sharp and clear as flint, echoed from the rocks above. "The assayer is a coward, and Liam Thorne is dead." A rifle barrel glinted in the sun. "That leaves you. Who are you?" Elias stood his ground, his hands away from his weapons. "I'm the man who's going to help you get what you're owed." He told her about the journal, the obsidian, the empty payroll wagons. He spoke of justice, a word that tasted like ash in his mouth, but was the only currency he had. He saw a flicker of movement, and then she was there, descending from the rocks with a fluid grace. She was younger than he expected, her face etched with the resolve that made her seem older. In her hands she held a rolled-up map, its edges worn from use. "Vance didn't just run me out of town," she said, her voice low and tight. "He stole my work. My maps. That one," she nodded to the roll in her hand, "is the only one he didn't get. It shows the real tunnels, the ones that aren't on Blackwood's official charts, the ones he uses to move his stolen gold." She had the knowledge. He had the purpose. A fragile alliance was forged in the dying light of the Badlands, a partnership born of shared enemies and a desperate need for retribution. The path forward was now clear, a treacherous route that would lead them directly into the heart of Vance's operation. The pursuit began at dawn. With Elara's map and Elias's skill, they moved with a purpose that felt both reckless and necessary. They rode hard, pushing their horses through the unforgiving terrain, the ghost of Liam a constant presence between them. The landscape itself was an adversary, a relentless gauntlet of sheer-walled canyons and razor-sharp scree fields. Water was scarce, and every sip was measured, every ounce rationed. They spoke little. Their communication boiled down to the essentials: a hand signal indicating a potential ambush spot, a quiet word about the condition of the horses, a shared glance that acknowledged the ever-present danger. Vance's men were never far behind. They were skilled trackers, but they were predictable. They followed the logical paths, the easiest routes. Elias, guided by Elara's intimate knowledge of the hidden ways, led them on a path of misdirection. They doubled back, used rocky ground to hide their tracks, and pushed through narrow passages that would tear a less determined rider to pieces. The first skirmish came 2 days out. A pair of outriders, sent ahead of the main posse, cornered them in a dry wash. There was no time for a plan, no room for error. It was pure instinct. Elias reacted instantly, his Colt clearing its holster in a single fluid motion. The first rider went down before he even knew he was in a fight. The second, smarter and more cautious, used his horse for cover. Gunsmoke filled the air, the crack of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Elara wasn't a passive observer. She pulled a Winchester from her saddle scabbard, her movements precise and economical. She laid down suppressing fire, forcing the second rider to keep his head down while Elias maneuvered for a better angle. It was over in seconds. 2 bodies lay in the dust, a stark reminder of the stakes. They didn't linger. They took what ammunition they could and rode on, the sound of their own horses' hooves a frantic, desperate rhythm. The encounter had cost them precious time and even more precious ammunition. Their resources were dwindling, but their resolve had hardened. They had survived the first test, their alliance no longer fragile, but tempered in the crucible of combat. They were no longer 2 individuals with a shared goal. They were a team, a single unit moving through the wilderness with a grim and unwavering determination. Their destination was a supposed safe haven, a small, isolated trading post run by a man named Silas, an old contact Elias had trusted in the past. Silas was a man who lived by a simple code: information for coin and his loyalty to the highest bidder. Elias was counting on their history to outweigh Vance's deeper pockets. They arrived under the cloak of darkness, their horses exhausted, their canteens nearly empty. Silas greeted them with a weary smile and a plate of hot food, his eyes betraying nothing. He listened to their story, his gaze shifting between Elias' determined face and the precious map Elara kept clutched in her hand. He offered them a place to rest, a secure room in the back of the post. He promised to send Vance's posse on a wild goose chase to buy them a day's head start. It was a lie. As they settled in, a sense of unease gnawed at Elias. The silence of the trading post was too deep, too absolute. He looked at Elara, and she nodded, a silent acknowledgment of their shared suspicion. The trap was sprung just before dawn. The heavy bar that should have secured their door had been removed from the outside. The room was a cage. Through the single barred window, they saw him. Sheriff Corbin Vance, astride a powerful black stallion, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Silas stood beside him, his head bowed, the jingle of fresh coin in his pocket, a clear confession of his betrayal. "The map, Thorne," Vance's voice boomed, cold and sharp. "And the girl? Give them to me, and I might let you ride out of here." Elias knew it was another lie. There was no escape. But there was defiance. With a shared look of grim understanding, Elias and Elara acted. Elara, quicker and smaller, scrambled onto the ruined single table, using it as a launch pad to kick out at the window's rotten frame. Elias, meanwhile, overturned the heavy wooden bed, bracing it against the door. The wood splintered under the first heavy blow from outside. As Elara worked frantically at the window, Elias pulled a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, a tool of his trade he always carried. He lit the fuse, the hiss a countdown to chaos. He shoved it into a crack in the adobe wall, the one furthest from the window. "Go!" he yelled. The explosion was deafening. It didn't bring the wall down, but it blew a ragged hole through it, filling the air with dust and debris. In the confusion, they scrambled through the opening, emerging into the pre-dawn light on the opposite side of the building. Vance's men were disoriented, their attention focused on the now breached door. But Vance himself was already reacting, his strategic mind assessing the new reality. He barked orders, sending his men to circle the building. The chase was on again, but this time it was different. They were on foot, their horses and supplies still inside the trading post. And Vance had the map. He held it up, a triumphant silhouette against the rising sun, before tucking it into his coat. They had escaped the trap, but they had lost everything. The stakes had been raised to an impossible height. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. On foot, exposed, and with nothing but the weapons in their hands, Elias and Elara fled into the labyrinth of canyons. The loss of the map was a devastating blow. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was their advantage, their key to the labyrinthine mines that served as Vance's treasury. Now the tables had turned. Vance had the guide, and they had only Elara's memory to rely on. The ticking clock was no longer a vague notion of an impending payroll shipment. It was the sound of Vance's posse closing in, their shouts echoing in the close-walled canyons. Thirst became their most immediate enemy. The desert was a kill, sucking the moisture from their bodies. Every step was a conscious effort, every breath a searing intake of superheated air. They had to find water, and they had to find a new plan. Elara, her face grim, led them to a hidden seep, a place not marked on any map, a secret she had kept for herself. The water was brackish and warm, but it was life. As they drank, their heads pressed against the cool, damp rock, a new strategy began to form. They couldn't outrun Vance. They couldn't fight his entire posse head-on. Their only option was to get ahead of him, to beat him to the prize. "He has the map," Elara said, her voice raspy. "But he doesn't know how to read it." "Not like I do." She explained that the map contained layers of information, decoy tunnels, and false passages designed to trap the unwary. The true route was hidden in a series of subtle markings, a code only she understood. Their new, desperate plan was to use Vance's confidence against him. They would take a shortcut, a dangerous, nearly impassable goat trail that would allow them to intercept Vance at the entrance to the main vault tunnel. It was a race against time, a high-stakes gamble that pitted Elara's knowledge and Elias' endurance against Vance's numbers, and the map he thought was his key to victory. The ascent was brutal. The trail was little more than a series of handholds and footholds on a sheer cliff face. A single misstep would mean a fall of several hundred feet. They moved in silence, the only sounds the scrape of their boots on the rock and their own ragged breathing. They were no longer just allies. They were a lifeline for each other, his strength supporting her, her knowledge guiding him. As they reached the summit, they could see them. Vance and his men, tiny figures moving through the canyon below, following the deceptive path on the stolen map. They were heading directly for a collapsed section of the tunnel, a dead end that would cost them precious hours. Elias and Elara had their opening. Their risky plan was working. They now had a chance to turn the tables, to transform their desperate flight into a calculated infiltration. The entrance to the old Blackwood mine was a dark maw in the side of the mountain, a place that had swallowed the hopes of countless prospectors. For Elias and Elara, it was the final battleground. They slipped inside, the cool, stale air a welcome relief from the relentless sun. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the single lantern Elias carried. Elara navigated the labyrinthine tunnels from memory, her hand trailing along the cold rock wall, her mind a compass in the subterranean maze. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They passed side tunnels shored up with rotting timbers, abandoned ore carts lying on their sides like the skeletal remains of forgotten beasts. This was Vance's bank, his hidden fortress. They found the vault, not a steel door with a combination lock, but a natural cavern, its entrance blocked by a carefully constructed wall of rock and mortar. A single heavy iron door was set into the wall, secured with a massive padlock. It was here that Vance stored the stolen Blackwood payrolls. There was no time to pick the lock, no way to force the door without alerting Vance's men, who would eventually find their way to the correct tunnel. The plan had to be smarter, faster. Elias, ever the pathfinder, saw the solution not in the door, but in the rock around it. He handed Elara the lantern and began to examine the ceiling of the tunnel, his fingers tracing the fine fractures in the stone. He pointed to a network of cracks directly above the entrance to the vault. "The blasting," he whispered. "It's made the whole section unstable." It was a desperate, dangerous idea. Create a rock slide, sealing the vault entrance permanently. It wouldn't get them the gold, but it would deny it to Vance. It would be the proof of his crimes, an inaccessible tomb for his stolen fortune. They worked with a frantic urgency, using a discarded pickaxe to chip away at the key support stones. It was a delicate, terrifying task. With each blow, a shower of dust and small pebbles rained down on them. The entire tunnel groaned, the mountain protesting their intrusion. Finally, with a deep, resonant crack, the ceiling began to give way. "Now," Elias yelled, pulling Elara back as the first of the heavy boulders fell. The collapse was a thundering, cataclysmic event, a roar of stone and earth that shook the very foundations of the mountain. When the dust settled, the iron door to the vault was gone, buried under tons of rock. They had succeeded. They had trapped the treasure. But as the echoes of the rockslide faded, they were replaced by another sound, the scrape of boots and the angry shouts of men. Vance and his posse had arrived, and Elias and Elara were trapped in the dead-end tunnel with their own handiwork. The confrontation was inevitable, a final, brutal calculus of tactics and will. Vance stood at the mouth of the tunnel, silhouetted by the daylight behind him, his men fanned out on either side. He was no longer the smug sheriff. His face was a mask of cold fury. The buried gold, the culmination of his ambition, was now just beyond his reach, and he knew who to blame. Thorn. His voice, tight with rage, echoed in the confined space. There's no way out. You've buried yourselves in your own grave. Elias and Elara flattened themselves against the rockfall, the dust-choked air thick with tension. They were outgunned and outnumbered. A direct firefight would be suicide. Their only advantage was the terrain they had just created. "We don't have to win," Elias whispered to Elara, his mind racing, assessing every shadow, every loose rock. "We just have to survive." The first volley of shots ripped through the darkness, bullets ricocheting off the rock walls with angry, whining sounds. Elias and Elara returned fire sparingly, their goal not to hit, but to suppress, to keep Vance's men from advancing. They were counting their rounds, each shot a carefully considered decision. This was where the Pathfinder's skills came into their own. He had noted the details of the tunnel on their way in. A forgotten shaft leading upwards, a pile of rotting timbers, a deep pool of stagnant water. He saw not a tomb, but a tactical puzzle box. Under the cover of their sporadic fire, he guided Elara towards the ventilation shaft, a narrow opening choked with debris. It was their only way out. As Elara scrambled up into the darkness, Elias prepared for the final act of their desperate play. He had one stick of dynamite left. It wasn't enough to clear the tunnel, but it was enough to create a diversion. He lit the fuse, the tiny spark a beacon of hope in the gloom. He didn't throw it. He wedged it into a crevice near the tunnel's entrance, a last, defiant trap for the man who had murdered his brother. He then scrambled up the shaft after Elara, pulling himself into the narrow, suffocating darkness just as the dynamite detonated. The explosion was followed by screams of pain and surprise. The blast had brought down another section of the tunnel roof, this time at the entrance, blocking the posse's advance and creating a wall of smoke and confusion. They had their chance. The shaft was a tight squeeze, a vertical climb through decades of dust and grime. They emerged into the blinding sunlight, gasping for air, their bodies bruised and scraped. Below, chaos reigned. Vance, caught in the blast but not killed, was trying to rally his disorganized men. But his authority was broken, his aura of invincibility shattered. In that moment, Elias had a choice. He had his rifle, and Vance was an easy target. It would be justice, swift and final. He raised the weapon, the sights centering on the silver star. But he hesitated. Killing Vance would make him a murderer, no better than the man who had killed his brother. Liam had died because of the truth, and the truth was now buried in the mountain. That was the victory. He lowered the rifle. Let the mountain be Vance's tomb. Let the sealed gold be his legacy of greed. He and Elara, without a word, turned and disappeared into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The journey away from the Blackwood mine was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. They moved under the cover of night, the moon their only guide. The sounds of Vance's disorganized posse faded behind them, swallowed by the immense silence of the frontier. They didn't stop until they reached a high ridge, a place where they could finally look back on the valley that held the town of redemption. The physical wounds were minor. Scrapes, bruises, the deep, aching fatigue of muscles pushed beyond their limit. They tended to them by the light of a small, smokeless fire, a shared task performed with an economy of motion that spoke of their now unbreakable bond. Elara cleaned and dressed a long gash on Elias's arm, her touch gentle but firm. Elias, in turn, offered her the last of their water, a gesture of trust that needed no words. The deeper wounds, the ones they couldn't see, would take longer to heal. The cost of their victory had been high. They had lost everything they started with, save for their lives and the truth. Elias thought of his brother, not with the burning rage that had fueled him, but with a quiet, profound sadness. He had not brought Liam's killer to justice in the conventional sense. Vance was still alive, his reputation likely in tatters, but not in a hangman's noose. "We didn't get the gold," Elara said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the long silence. "No," Elias replied, his gaze fixed on the distant, twinkling lights of the town. "But he did." He explained his reasoning, the choice he had made in that final moment. The truth wasn't in a ledger or a bag of gold. The truth was that Vance was a thief, and now his treasure was his prison. The story of the collapse would spread. Blackwood Mining would send investigators. The federal marshals he'd bluffed about to the Assair might just make a real appearance. Vance's empire, built on lies and stolen wealth, would crumble from within. They had not extracted vengeance. They had set a truth in motion, a slow-acting poison that would do its work long after they were gone. Debts had been settled, just not in the way he had imagined. Liam's name was not officially cleared, but in the only way that mattered, it was. He was not a horse thief. He was a man who had died to protect the truth. That was his real legacy, and Elias had honored it. As dawn approached, a new sense of clarity settled over Elias. The fire that had driven him across the Badlands had cooled, replaced by a quiet resolve. The cycle of violence was broken, not by another killing, but by a choice. He had proven his brother's innocence to the only person who mattered, himself. He looked at Elara, her face illuminated by the first rays of the rising sun. She was no longer just a source of information, a catalyst for his quest. She was a partner, a fellow survivor who had faced the same dangers and emerged, like him, irrevocably changed. "What now?" she asked, the question hanging in the cool morning air. It was a question that encompassed everything: their future, their purpose, their place in a world that had tried its best to crush them. For Elias, the path ahead was uncertain. The life of a solitary pathfinder, the only one he had ever known, now seemed hollow, a lonely existence defined by landscapes rather than connections. The journey with Elara had shown him the strength that came from trust, from relying on someone other than himself. He could return to that life, but it would be a retreat, a step backward. Redemption was a place of ghosts, of painful memories. There was nothing for him there. The open trail, the vast, untamed frontier, was his home. But perhaps he no longer had to walk it alone. "The map you had," he said, changing the subject, but not really. "The one Vance took. There were other places marked on it, places beyond this territory." Elara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Places no one has mapped yet. New territories. New beginnings." The implication was clear, an unspoken invitation. A new map to follow, a new trail to blaze. Not one of revenge, but one of discovery. The land, vast and unchanging, stretched out before them. It was the same landscape he had traveled his entire life, but he was seeing it through new eyes. He was no longer just a pathfinder. He was a man who had fought for something more than survival. He was transformed. He had started his journey to reclaim his brother's past, and in the end, he had found his own future. He looked at Elara, then to the horizon, a line of endless possibility. "Well," Elias said, kicking dirt over the last of the embers, "we're not getting any younger." He stood up, offering her a hand. She took it. Together, they turned their backs on redemption and walked towards the rising sun, two changed souls on a new and uncharted path. The ride was not over. It had just begun.